"You're going to prison today," the white officer said without a trace of hesitation, his voice echoing across the granite entrance of the federal courthouse as every nearby conversation suddenly faded into silence. Few people stopped walking at first. Most assumed they were witnessing another routine arrest outside one of the busiest government buildings in the city. But routine had nothing to do with what was unfolding that crisp Monday morning in downtown Washington, D.C. The woman standing before him never raised her voice. She didn't argue. She didn't step backward. She simply met his stare with a calm expression that somehow made the moment even more unsettling. Around them, attorneys hurried towards security checkpoints carrying leather briefcases. Reporters adjusted camera equipment near the courthouse steps. Deputy marshals monitored the growing crowd. The American flag drifted gently above the marble columns as sunlight reflected across polished stone, creating the illusion that justice itself was waiting just beyond the heavy bronze doors. Yet justice often arrives quietly, long before anyone recognizes its face. Officer Ethan Walker had built a reputation for acting first and asking questions later. Many admired what they called confidence. Others whispered that it looked more like arrogance dressed in a badge. This morning, he believed he had found another person trying to outsmart the system. Standing before him was a black woman wearing a simple navy blazer, carrying a slim leather portfolio, her posture composed and her eyes steady despite the growing attention surrounding them. There was nothing flashy about her appearance. No expensive jewelry. No official robe. No visible credentials hanging around her neck. To Ethan, that confirmed everything he already believed. He pointed toward the courthouse entrance before speaking loudly enough for everyone nearby to hear. "Federal property isn't a place for games. You don't get to walk in here pretending to be someone you're not." A few curious bystanders slowed their pace. Someone across the street quietly lifted a phone and began recording. Another courthouse visitor exchanged an uneasy glance with a colleague but continued walking without saying a word. The woman remained silent for another moment before answering in an even, respectful tone. "Officer, I think there's been a misunderstanding." Ethan barely allowed her sentence to finish. "Save it for the judge," he replied sharply. "You're facing serious federal charges after this." The words landed heavily in the cool morning air. Prison. Federal charges. Illegal entry. The accusations spread through the crowd faster than facts ever could. The woman looked briefly toward the courthouse doors, then back at the officer. There was no fear in her eyes. Only patience. It was the kind of patience earned by someone who understood exactly how quickly appearances could deceive. She adjusted her grip on the leather portfolio without resisting, almost as though she were waiting for something far more important than an argument to arrive. Ethan interpreted her composure as surrender. He had no idea that every passing second was quietly changing the course of his own future. What he believed was the beginning of another successful arrest was, in reality, the first irreversible step toward the end of everything he had spent years trying to build. And hidden behind those courthouse doors, someone was already wondering why federal judge Naomi Brooks had not yet arrived for the most important hearing of the month. 45 minutes earlier, the city had awakened beneath a pale blue sky that promised another ordinary workday, and nothing about the streets surrounding the courthouse suggested that history was quietly preparing to unfold. Government employees hurried toward office buildings carrying coffee cups and briefcases. Delivery trucks rolled past security barriers with practiced precision. The sidewalks filled with attorneys reviewing case files, witnesses rehearsing testimony beneath their breath, and families hoping that by sunset their lives would somehow look different. Naomi Brooks drove through the downtown streets in a modest dark gray sedan that blended easily into the morning traffic. She preferred it that way. After years on the federal bench, she had learned that real authority rarely announced itself. It simply arrived, did its work, and left without demanding attention. Her leather portfolio rested neatly on the passenger seat beside a carefully organized folder containing notes, for a hearing expected to draw national attention. The case involved allegations of official misconduct, and every decision made inside that courtroom would be examined by legal scholars, journalists, and citizens across the country. Naomi understood the weight of responsibility better than anyone, Yet her expression remained calm as she parked several blocks away instead of using the reserved judicial entrance. She enjoyed the short walk. It reminded her that every person entering the courthouse carried a story, whether they wore a business suit, a maintenance uniform, or ordinary clothes. Justice belonged to all of them equally. She stepped onto the sidewalk wearing a simple navy blazer over a light blouse, comfortable shoes, and nothing that identified her position. Years earlier, a mentor had told her that respect earned through appearance vanished quickly, but respect earned through character stayed long after titles disappeared. Those words had shaped every chapter of her career. As she crossed the final intersection, she paused briefly to help an elderly visitor locate the correct courthouse entrance before continuing toward the front plaza. The woman thanked her with a grateful smile, never realizing she had just received directions from the very judge presiding over one of the building's most significant hearings. Naomi checked the time on her watch. She still had several minutes before the morning docket would begin. She appreciated arriving early enough to review her notes in silence before entering the courtroom. Across the plaza, courthouse employees greeted one another by name while deputy marshals conducted routine security checks. Reporters adjusted microphones in anticipation of statements expected later that afternoon. Everything appeared orderly, predictable, almost peaceful. Yet experience had taught Naomi that the greatest tests of character rarely announced themselves in advance. They appeared unexpectedly, disguised as ordinary moments that invited ordinary reactions. She had spent decades reminding young attorneys that dignity was often measured not during victory but during misunderstanding. As she approached the broad stone staircase leading toward the entrance, she noticed a patrol officer observing the crowd with unusual intensity. His eyes moved from face to face before settling on her for just a fraction longer than everyone else. Naomi barely acknowledged the glance. She had encountered suspicion before, and she refused to let it define either her day or her purpose. She tightened her grip on the leather portfolio and continued forward with the quiet confidence of someone who knew exactly where she belonged, completely unaware that within the next few minutes a single encounter would place her patience, her principles, and another person's future on a collision course that neither of them could stop. Officer Ethan Walker had spent nearly 12 years wearing the same uniform, and somewhere along the way he had convinced himself that instinct mattered more than listening. He believed confidence solved problems before questions ever could. As he watched the steady stream of people approaching the courthouse, he mentally sorted strangers into simple categories within seconds. Lawyers carried themselves differently. Government officials usually displayed credentials before anyone asked. Tourists looked lost. Employees moved with purpose. And then there was the woman in the navy blazer, walking alone with nothing more than a leather portfolio and quiet determination. Something about her presence challenged assumptions he had stopped realizing he was making years ago. Instead of considering innocent explanations, his mind immediately searched for reasons she did not belong. Naomi Brooks noticed him stepping into her path before she reached the security checkpoint. She stopped politely, offering a calm smile that reflected years of professional courtesy rather than uncertainty. "Good morning, officer," she said evenly. "Good morning?" Ethan replied, studying her from head to toe. "Where do you think you are going?" "Inside the courthouse," Naomi answered. "I have business there this morning." Ethan folded his arms. "What kind of business?" She maintained steady eye contact. "Official business." The answer only seemed to increase his suspicion. "Official for who?" he asked. Naomi paused briefly before responding. "For the court." Ethan let out a quiet laugh that carried just enough volume for nearby pedestrians to notice. "Everybody suddenly has official business when they get asked questions." Several people walking nearby slowed almost instinctively. A young law student waiting for the pedestrian signal glanced toward the conversation before continuing to watch from a respectful distance. Two courthouse employees exchanged uncertain looks but chose not to interrupt. Naomi remained remarkably composed. "Officer, I am expected inside shortly. If there is any concern, I will gladly identify myself through the proper process." Ethan shook his head before she even finished speaking. "Not until I decide you should." His words carried an unmistakable finality. Naomi could sense that logic alone would not change the direction of the conversation. During her years on the bench, she had watched countless misunderstandings escalate because pride refused to make room for patience. She quietly reminded herself of the same principle she often shared with attorneys arguing before her courtroom. Stay calm. Let facts arrive before conclusions. Ethan stepped closer, keeping his voice firm enough for everyone nearby to hear. You expect me to believe someone dressed like you just walks into federal court claiming official business? Naomi answered without changing her tone. I expect every citizen to be treated fairly while facts are verified. The sentence lingered in the morning air. Some members of the growing crowd lowered their eyes. Others continued watching in complete silence. Ethan interpreted her confidence as defiance instead of professionalism. He had become so certain of his first impression that every calm answer sounded suspicious to him. What he failed to notice was that several courthouse employees had quietly stopped what they were doing. One security supervisor stared toward Naomi with visible confusion. A deputy clerk standing inside the glass entrance looked twice before reaching for the telephone on her desk. Neither of them reacted out of panic. They reacted because something about the woman outside did not fit the story unfolding before their eyes. Meanwhile, Naomi simply waited, knowing that truth often required nothing more than enough time for the right people to arrive. The quiet tension outside the courthouse slowly transformed into something impossible to ignore. More people stopped walking, not because anyone had shouted, but because silence itself had become unusual. Officer Ethan Walker reached for his radio and requested another unit to respond to what he described as a possible security concern. His words carried enough authority that several nearby visitors instinctively stepped farther away, creating an open circle around Naomi Brooks. She remained exactly where she stood, her leather portfolio resting calmly at her side, her breathing steady, her expression unchanged. She understood that dignity often spoke louder than anger, especially when everyone else expected the opposite. Ethan interpreted her composure as stubbornness. You have had every opportunity to cooperate, he declared. Instead, you keep giving vague answers. Naomi answered with the same measured tone she had used from the beginning. Officer, I have cooperated with every lawful request. I simply ask that you verify the facts before reaching conclusions. Ethan shook his head. You do not get to tell me how to do my job. A young attorney standing several yards away quietly whispered to his colleague that something about the situation did not feel right. Across the entrance plaza, a courthouse security supervisor had already placed a call inside the building after recognizing Naomi from previous judicial ceremonies, but the supervisor could not immediately leave his assigned post. Inside the courthouse, the morning docket continued moving toward its scheduled start. Court clerks organized files. Bailiffs prepared the courtroom. Several attorneys looked at the clock with growing concern because the judge assigned to preside over the first hearing had not yet entered chambers. Outside, Ethan asked Naomi one final time to explain why she believed she belonged inside the federal courthouse. Naomi looked directly at him before answering. Because I have a responsibility waiting for me inside. Ethan smiled with visible disbelief. The only responsibility you need to worry about right now is answering questions. He motioned toward another officer who had just arrived. The second officer slowed as he approached, sensing the unusual atmosphere created by the silent crowd. Without fully understanding the situation, he deferred to Ethan's judgment. Nearby, more phones appeared in people's hands. Some visitors quietly recorded from a distance, not to create a spectacle, but because government buildings were places where accountability mattered. Naomi noticed the cameras but paid them little attention. She had spent her entire career believing that truth rarely depended upon the loudest voice. It depended upon the clearest record. Ethan continued speaking with increasing confidence, convinced that public certainty reinforced professional authority. You are delaying federal business, he announced. If this continues, the consequences are going to become much more serious. Naomi answered softly. Officer, I sincerely hope you reconsider before this goes any further. Her words were neither a warning nor a threat. They sounded more like genuine concern. Ethan completely misunderstood them. To him, they sounded like someone attempting to intimidate law enforcement. To several observers, however, they sounded like the final opportunity to prevent an irreversible mistake. At that very moment, beyond the courthouse doors, a senior courtroom deputy received confirmation that Judge Naomi Brooks had still not checked in. Realizing something was deeply unusual, he immediately left his office and headed toward the main entrance, unaware that with every step he took, the truth was moving closer to the crowd gathered outside. The atmosphere outside the courthouse shifted in ways that most people could feel but few could explain. Nobody raised their voice. Nobody rushed forward. Yet the confidence that had surrounded Officer Ethan Walker only moments earlier began to meet something far stronger than confrontation. It met quiet doubt. The courthouse security supervisor continued speaking into his radio, his eyes never leaving Naomi Brooks. From inside the building, another employee hurried toward the lobby entrance after receiving an unexpected question from a courtroom clerk. "Has Judge Brooks arrived yet?" The answer came back almost immediately. "No. We cannot locate her." Those simple words traveled through the courthouse faster than anyone outside realized. In the meantime, Ethan remained convinced that every passing second justified his decision. He believed hesitation from others meant they trusted his judgment. What he could not see was that several courthouse employees were no longer watching Naomi. They were watching him. Naomi stood with remarkable patience, her leather portfolio still resting comfortably at her side. She glanced briefly toward the courthouse clock mounted above the entrance. The scheduled hearing would begin in only a few minutes. She understood dozens of attorneys, witnesses, clerks, and families were already waiting inside. Even so, she made no attempt to push past the officers or force the situation. Her entire career had been built upon respect for legal process, especially when that process became inconvenient. A young deputy clerk finally stepped through the revolving doors before stopping several yards away. He looked carefully at Naomi, then back toward Ethan. Confusion crossed his face. He quietly reached for his telephone instead of interrupting. Nearby, a United States Marshal exiting the building noticed the same unusual gathering and slowed his pace. He did not immediately intervene. Instead, he carefully observed the interaction, sensing that important details were still missing. Around the plaza, more visitors had stopped walking altogether. Some recognized the courthouse staff appearing increasingly unsettled. Others simply sensed that something ordinary had quietly become extraordinary. Ethan continued speaking with complete certainty. "This could have ended much differently if you had simply answered my questions." Naomi replied in the same composed voice that had never once risen above a normal conversation. "I answered every question truthfully." Ethan dismissed her response with a slight shake of his head. Truth is easy to claim. Verification is different. Naomi looked at him for a brief moment before saying something that several nearby observers would remember long after the morning ended. "Verification is exactly what I have been asking for." The sentence lingered in the air. Nobody responded immediately. It was difficult to ignore how calmly she continued speaking despite the growing audience surrounding them. Across the entrance, the deputy clerk finally reached someone inside the judicial chambers. His voice remained low, but urgency replaced routine. "I believe you should come downstairs right away." Within seconds, another call reached the office of the chief judge. At the same time, courthouse security quietly reviewed the exterior surveillance cameras, confirming the timeline of everything that had happened since Naomi first stepped onto the plaza. Every respectful answer, every public accusation, every decision had already become part of an official record. Outside, Ethan still believed the morning belonged entirely to him. Inside, people who knew Naomi Brooks personally were already moving toward the entrance. The distance between misunderstanding and undeniable truth had narrowed to only a few steps, and neither badges nor assumptions would be able to slow what was about to walk through those courthouse doors. Inside the courthouse, the rhythm of the morning had begun to break. Courtroom deputies exchanged uncertain glances as the scheduled hearing remained on hold for the first time in months. Attorneys who had practiced before the same courtroom for years knew that Judge Naomi Brooks valued punctuality above almost everything else. She was never late without reason. That fact alone was enough to unsettle those who knew her best. The chief judge's judicial assistant walked briskly through the marble hallway after receiving the deputy clerk's call. "She has not entered the building?" he asked. "No," the clerk answered. "But I believe we know where she is." Without another word, both of them headed toward the main entrance. Outside, Officer Ethan Walker remained convinced that he was maintaining order. The growing crowd no longer made him uncomfortable. Instead, he viewed it as proof that people expected decisive action from law enforcement. He straightened his uniform and glanced toward the courthouse doors, unaware that the people now approaching were not arriving to support his judgment. Naomi Brooks noticed subtle changes long before anyone else spoke. Through the glass entrance, she recognized familiar faces moving quickly across the lobby. She had worked beside many of them for years. None of them looked angry. They looked concerned. Even then, she made no attempt to call out to them. She simply waited, allowing events to unfold naturally. Her patience was not weakness. It came from decades of believing that truth became stronger when it never needed to chase attention. A United States Marshal standing near the entrance quietly adjusted his earpiece after receiving a message. He looked carefully at Naomi, then at Ethan, then back toward the approaching courthouse officials. His expression shifted almost imperceptibly. He understood that whatever misunderstanding had begun outside was about to end in full public view. Nearby, several visitors sensed the same change without knowing why. Conversations became whispers. Reporters lowered their microphones instead of raising them. Even the people recording with their telephones seemed to stop moving, as though instinct told them they were seconds away from witnessing something unforgettable. Ethan noticed the courthouse doors opening and assumed someone was coming to confirm his actions. Confidence settled across his face once again. He believed official validation was finally arriving. "Good," he said quietly. "Now we can clear this up." Naomi looked toward the entrance with the same calm expression she had maintained all morning. The heavy bronze doors opened wider, and a senior courtroom deputy stepped onto the plaza, followed closely by the chief judge's judicial assistant and two experienced courthouse officials. Before they had even crossed half the distance, their eyes settled immediately on Naomi. None of them looked surprised to see her. Instead, they looked relieved. The judicial assistant quickened his pace despite years of carefully measured professionalism. Ethan interpreted the urgency differently. He believed they were hurrying to receive custody of someone who had disrupted courthouse operations. Around the plaza, the crowd instinctively stepped aside, creating a clear path between the courthouse entrance and the woman who had remained composed from the very beginning. The silence became almost overwhelming. Nobody laughed. Nobody spoke. Every pair of eyes followed the approaching officials. Ethan waited confidently for the confirmation he believed was only moments away. Naomi remained perfectly still, her leather portfolio resting against her side, as the distance between misunderstanding and truth disappeared one quiet step at a time. The senior courtroom deputy reached Naomi Brooks first and stopped only a few feet away. Without hesitation, he offered a respectful nod that immediately caught the attention of everyone watching. "Good morning, Your Honor," he said clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "We have been looking for you. The courtroom is ready whenever you are." The word settled over the courthouse plaza like a sudden change in the weather. Every conversation stopped. The attorneys standing near the entrance looked from the deputy to Naomi and then toward Officer Ethan Walker, each of them silently realizing that the story unfolding before them was nothing like they had first assumed. Ethan frowned, convinced there had been some mistake. "Your Honor?" he repeated quietly, almost to himself. Before anyone could answer, the chief judge's judicial assistant stepped forward with visible concern. "Judge Brooks," he said respectfully, "we were worried when you did not arrive through the judicial entrance. The entire court is waiting for today's hearing." Naomi acknowledged him with a calm smile. "I was delayed outside," she answered simply. She did not point at Ethan. She did not accuse anyone. She merely stated the truth exactly as it had happened. The restraint in her voice made the moment even more powerful. Ethan looked from one courthouse official to another, searching for some sign that this was an elaborate misunderstanding. Instead, he saw only recognition. Every courthouse employee who had arrived addressed Naomi with the same respect reserved for a federal judge. The United States Marshal standing nearby immediately straightened his posture. Several attorneys instinctively stepped aside to clear a path. Even visitors who had no idea who Naomi was only moments earlier now understood they were witnessing someone entrusted with one of the highest responsibilities in the federal judiciary. Ethan's confidence began to dissolve beneath the weight of undeniable reality. His eyes settled briefly on the leather portfolio Naomi had carried all morning. Suddenly it no longer looked ordinary. It looked exactly like the case materials a judge would bring into court. He remembered every assumption he had made, every conclusion he had reached before verifying the facts, every opportunity he had been given to slow down and simply ask one more question. Around the plaza, the silence became almost complete. The people recording with their telephones lowered them slightly, not because the moment had become less important, but because it had become unexpectedly human. Nobody celebrated. Nobody mocked the officer. They simply watched as certainty gave way to truth. The chief judge's judicial assistant turned politely toward Ethan. "Officer," he said in a measured tone, "this is the Honorable Naomi Brooks of the United States District Court." There was no anger in his voice. There was no attempt to embarrass anyone publicly. The statement itself was enough. Ethan felt the meaning of those words before he could fully process them. Every decision made during the past several minutes replayed silently in his mind. Naomi looked directly at him with the same calm expression she had maintained since their first conversation. "Officer Walker," she said gently, "I asked only that the facts be verified." Her words contained neither triumph nor resentment. They carried only quiet conviction. In that single moment, everyone standing outside the courthouse witnessed a lesson that reached far beyond one mistaken encounter. Authority could command attention, but integrity earned respect, and the difference between the two had just become impossible for anyone there to ignore. Officer Ethan Walker stood motionless as the realization settled over the courthouse plaza. Only minutes earlier, he had believed complete confidence was the same as being correct. Now every certainty he had relied upon had been replaced by undeniable facts. No one raised their voice. No one celebrated his mistake. The silence surrounding him carried far more weight than public criticism ever could. The United States Marshal stepped forward with calm professionalism and quietly requested that another supervisor join them outside. Within moments, a senior law enforcement administrator arrived from inside the building after being briefed by courthouse officials. His first request was simple. "Please preserve all body camera recordings and radio communications from this incident." The instruction was delivered without accusation or emotion. It reflected standard procedure whenever questions about official conduct required careful review. Ethan slowly nodded. For the first time that morning, he did not have an immediate answer. Nearby, courthouse security confirmed that exterior surveillance cameras had recorded the entire encounter from multiple angles. The deputy clerk who had first recognized Judge Naomi Brooks documented the timeline exactly as it had unfolded. Several attorneys who had witnessed the exchange voluntarily identified themselves in case formal statements became necessary. Even the visitors who had quietly recorded portions of the interaction informed courthouse personnel that they were willing to cooperate if asked. Accountability was arriving from every direction, not through anger, but through documentation. Naomi Brooks watched the process unfold without interruption. She understood that institutions earned public trust only when they were willing to examine difficult moments honestly. The chief judge's judicial assistant turned toward her and apologized for the unexpected delay to the morning's proceedings. Naomi answered with quiet grace. "The hearing can begin once everyone has completed the responsibilities that belong to them." Her response surprised several people standing nearby. She did not demand immediate punishment. She did not ask for special treatment because of her position. She simply insisted that the same legal process protecting every citizen should also guide the review of what had happened outside the courthouse. The supervising administrator then addressed Ethan directly. Officer Walker, effective immediately, you are relieved from further duties today pending an administrative review. Please accompany me inside. The words were respectful, measured, and entirely procedural. Ethan lowered his eyes for a brief moment before removing his radio and handing it to the supervisor. Around the plaza, no one applauded. The crowd slowly began to disperse, returning to work, appointments, and responsibilities. Yet many left carrying a lesson they would remember long after the morning ended. Several people who had watched the encounter from the beginning realized how easily confidence could overshadow fairness when assumptions replaced verification. As Ethan walked toward the courthouse entrance, he glanced once more at Naomi. She met his eyes without resentment. There was disappointment, but there was also compassion. She knew that one poor decision could change a career, just as one fair decision could restore faith in an entire system. The investigation would determine every fact, review every recording, and examine every decision according to established procedures. That was how justice was meant to work. It did not depend upon outrage. It depended upon evidence, integrity, and the willingness to let truth speak louder than assumption. And on that quiet morning outside the courthouse, the truth had finally begun speaking for itself. By the time the courthouse settled back into its familiar rhythm, the morning had already become part of its history. Attorneys returned to their courtrooms. Witnesses took their seats. Families waited quietly in the gallery, hoping for justice in their own cases. From the outside, the building looked exactly as it had only an hour earlier, yet everyone who had stood on the front plaza understood that something important had changed. Judge Naomi Brooks entered her courtroom without mentioning the incident that had delayed her arrival. She greeted every attorney with the same professionalism she had demonstrated throughout her career. The hearing began precisely where the law required it to begin, with facts, fairness, and equal respect for every person before the bench. No reference was made to what had happened outside. Her responsibility was not to relive the morning. It was to uphold the principles she had sworn to protect. Elsewhere in the building, the administrative review had already started. Supervisors gathered body camera recordings, radio transmissions, security footage, and witness statements. Every decision would be examined through established procedures rather than emotion. The process was neither rushed nor influenced by public attention. It followed the same standards expected in every professional review because confidence in the justice system depended upon consistency more than headlines. Officer Ethan Walker sat quietly in an administrative office waiting for the review to continue. For the first time in many years, he found himself replaying conversations instead of defending them. He remembered every opportunity he had been given to pause, to verify, and to listen. He realized that authority had never guaranteed accuracy, and that assumptions, once allowed to replace facts, could carry consequences far beyond a single encounter. Outside the courthouse, many of the people who had witnessed the morning continued talking about what they had seen. Some spoke about professionalism. Others spoke about accountability. But nearly everyone agreed on one point. The most remarkable person in the entire encounter had been the woman who never allowed anger to replace dignity. She had not demanded respect through fear. She had earned it through character. Several weeks later, after the review was completed, the findings emphasized the importance of verification, impartial decision-making, and adherence to professional standards. Additional training and corrective actions were implemented to strengthen public trust and reinforce the responsibilities carried by every officer serving the community. The courthouse itself moved forward, but the lessons from that morning remained. New employees heard the story during discussions about ethics and public service. Experienced professionals used it as a reminder that every interaction mattered because every citizen deserved to be treated with fairness before conclusions were reached. Judge Naomi Brooks never spoke publicly about herself as the central figure in the incident. When asked privately why she had remained so calm, she simply answered that justice was strongest when it reflected patience instead of pride. Those who knew her understood that the statement described far more than one morning outside a courthouse. It described an entire career devoted to the belief that the law belonged to everyone equally. And perhaps that became the greatest lesson of all. A badge may represent authority, and a robe may represent responsibility, but neither defines a person's character. Character is revealed in the moments before the truth becomes obvious. On that quiet morning, one person relied on assumptions while another relied on integrity. In the end, assumptions lost their voice, but integrity echoed long after the courthouse doors had closed.